Welcome to Lesson 5 of Learning to Fish. In our previous lesson, we explored the concept of looking at the context of Scripture, specifically looking at the historical context of Scripture. We said that it is important to know how a particular passage fits within the history it was written so that we don't misinterpret what the author was intending his original audience to understand as he addressed them. In a way, we are trying to get into the mind both of the author and the audience. I mean, wouldn't it be cool if we could just time travel and land at the time and place where the biblical audience moved and lived? If we were there on the plains of Moab when Moses delivered the law to the people of Israel, don't you think we'd have a clear understanding of the importance of the law to that nation as they were just about to settle into the promised land? Or what about being in the persecuted church of Philippi when the pastor stands up to read a letter from Paul, written from a Roman jail cell where he says, "Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say, rejoice." What would that have felt like? While we can't literally travel back in time, what we can do is a bit of historical research. In fact, we can do tons of it since there is nearly an endless source of historical record and evidence that will give us a pretty clear picture of what it was like for people living centuries and even millennia ago. In doing historical research, we're trying to think and understand words, ideas, places, situations the way they did. This helps us accurately understand Scripture. In this lesson, we're going to do something similar, but instead of looking at the passage in its historical context, we're going to look at it in its literary context. Like historical context, this is going to help us get into the mind of the author. So, what is literary context? Well, we can break it down into two primary elements. First, the particular literary genre of a book or passage, and two, the thought flow of a book or passage. So let's start with genre. Genre is a word that you might hear once in a while. It's a French word which simply means a kind. So, like a genre of music, for instance, is referring to a kind of music, such as jazz or baroque or hip-hop. Those are all genres. In the literary sense, genre is the writing style used in composition. A good way to think of a genre is like a sports game. So in sports, each sport has its own set of rules by which you interpret the game. For instance, scoring differs from one game to another. In golf, if you got a score of 100, you'd be rather disappointed. But in basketball, it might be pretty good. In soccer, only one person uses their hands while the rest use their feet, whereas in football, it's pretty much the opposite. If you know the rules as a viewer, you can follow the sport and appreciate it. You know when something is good or bad, or why the guy dressed like a zebra is waving his hands in a certain way. If you've ever watched a sport with a person who doesn't know the rules, or if you yourself are watching a sport without knowing the rules, it can be exhausting and frustrating. Wait, why was that a score? Or what did he do wrong? Why is everyone cheering? Knowing the rules can determine whether it's exciting or boring, fun or frustrating. We could broaden it not only to the rules, but also to the art and skill of a sport. A good football fan gets excited when he sees an amazing catch because he knows it's an amazing catch, whereas the next guy isn't excited at all. The same can be said for understanding the genre of a passage in the Bible. In the book of Psalms, for instance, we read 150 pieces of literature, all written in Hebrew poetry. And then within Hebrew poetry, there are different subgenres of poetry and different rhetorical devices. It's packed with parallelism that's carefully and artfully written. When understood, it's powerful and life-changing. But if you don't know the rules, it may look kind of bland and be sort of frustrating to read. Understanding the genre isn't everything, but it sure helps in appreciating a particular work or passage. So that's genre. The second element is thought flow, or the argument of the writing. This is quite possibly the most important element of actually doing the work of study and understanding Scripture. Why is that? Because it involves the simple reading and rereading of the text. I read one professor who said that 75% of the hermeneutical errors that people make when studying the Bible could be avoided by this step, and that is likely conservatively true. When we come to a verse in Scripture, We've got to remember that other than perhaps Proverbs and poetry, the Bible was not written in verses. When the Apostle John, for instance, wrote John 3:16, he didn't look back after penning chapter 3 and say, well, verse 16 is going to be a zinger. He didn't write verse 16. He wrote paragraphs contained in sections, contained in the Gospel of John, and so on. In other words, he wrote like you and I would write. He wrote a completed work that had a big idea in mind when he wrote it. The words that have been labeled verse 16 are just part of the argument that John is making. The verses that we have in our Bibles were added centuries after the works were written as a helpful point of reference. So we got to be careful not to look at the verses as isolated, unconnected thoughts. Sometimes it's helpful to read a printing of the Bible that doesn't have verse marks because they can actually distract from the flow of thought. So how do we read a verse or a paragraph in its context? Well, there are a few key, and we might say common sense essentials in doing this. Number one, we want to read the book, letter, gospel, psalm, etc. in its entirety. This is a must if we're going to really get the point of a particular passage. Read it the way the original audience would have read and heard it. Now you might think, wow, that's a lot of effort just to understand a couple of verses. For some books, it may be a bit of work, but for most, it's actually a pretty easy thing to do, especially now that we can listen to it. The other day, I was working out in the yard listening to the book of 1 Corinthians. Our adult fellowship teacher, who is teaching through the book, is out on vacation for a few weeks and challenged us to read through the book twice before our next class. So I was working outside, I put in my earbuds and listened through Paul's letter to Corinth. And I couldn't believe how quickly it was actually finished. It really doesn't take that long. But what was also amazing is what I learned while listening. I've read the book more than once. I've preached from it, gone through it in my personal devotions, taught through the book verse by verse over the course of weeks, months to a Sunday school class. Yet after listening through it in one sitting, or yard working, in my case, things that I hadn't understood before became much clearer. As we do this a couple of times, we get a much clearer picture of what the author's mind was when he wrote to the audience. So read the text, the whole work. Now, if we were to do a full literary analysis, we would move on to the second essential, and that is to summarize the paragraphs and sections within the book. In this step, our aim is to sort of outline the thought flow of the writer. Often the Bible versions or printings already have paragraph breaks, and these aren't hard and fast divisions that can't be altered, but they are very handy in this process. Essentially, we're going to go paragraph by paragraph, asking and answering the question, what is this section about? In doing this, we're typically going to find a couple of different things. First, we're going to find, or at least begin to see a progression of thought. And second, we're going to begin to see larger sections develop from these paragraphs. Let's take a look at Romans chapter 1 through 3, for example. After Paul's introduction to the church at Rome in verses 1 through 17, he launches from here into a very clear progression of thought as he explains the sinfulness of humanity. And I want you to watch how he walks through this issue. In chapter 1, verses 18 through 32, he demonstrates how the godless, unrighteous man displays the sinfulness of humanity, as well as the consequences that follow. In chapter 2, 1 through 16, Paul moves to the moralist. That is the moral man who tries to, through morality, to live righteously but still fails because of his inherent sinfulness. In chapter 2, 17 through 3:8, Paul moves on to the Jew, the religious man who thinks that through his religion, he can somehow obtain righteousness. He fails as well, not able to practice what he even practice what he preaches. Finally, the rest of chapter 3, Paul addresses the whole of humanity and concludes that every single person in the world is a sinner. If we have the time, we could show that each of these paragraphs has these themes. And this helps us as we're studying a particular passage. If we kind of landed in chapter 2, for instance, it would be helpful to know how chapter 2 relates to Paul's thought progress in 1 and 3 about human sinfulness. If we kept going through this process, we could outline the whole epistle of Romans. So not only would we see the progression of thought on a micro level, we'd also see major thought movements as we see these paragraphs fall into big sections. Going back to the book of Romans, Paul's discussion in chapters 1 through 3 is one part of his overall argument. It's a section. Chapters 4 through 8 is another section. It follows his thoughts concerning man's sinfulness to how man is now both justified and sanctified through the gospel. Chapters 9 through 11 is another section which focuses on God's dealing with Israel in this whole picture of the gospel. And then chapters 12 through 15 deal with God's work in the life of the believers of the church, so that those who have been justified and sanctified are to live out the gospel in their lives. So in summarizing these paragraphs and sections in the book, we're essentially creating an outline. We can go from there and make subpoints and sub-subpoints and so on, and see how each individual passage fits into the whole. So let's take a look at our third essential in viewing a passage in its literary context. After reading it and discovering the thought flow through paragraph summary, we are then able to develop a thesis statement, or what is sometimes called, and I like the term, the big idea. So when Paul wrote to Romans, what was the big idea he was trying to communicate? What central thought spurred him to put his pen to parchment and send a letter by hand across Rome? Reading through the book and seeing the thought flow allows us then to boil the book down to this one idea. This is what we're after. This step helps immensely as we're studying individual verses and passages. Instead of this verse or this group of verses that we're looking at sort of floating out there as standalone thought, we can see whether our understanding of that verse fits in line with the main point of the book. In other words, we're asking, how do these select verses that I'm studying serve to advance the argument of the book? How do they help propel the big idea? The same goes for our paragraph and section summaries. We're asking, how does this paragraph help move the big idea or make it more clear, advance the main thought? Sometimes we'll find that we need to go back and correct some of our paragraph summaries as we see more clearly how they fit in light of the whole argument. And sometimes we need to do the reverse. We'll say, this is what the book is about, and then discover after looking at the text again, maybe this isn't exactly the big idea. Maybe I need to do some tweaking of my thesis statement based on the text. The more we do this, the more clear of a picture we will get of the text we're trying to study and of the whole book itself. After doing this, then, we start to look then with a magnifying glass at the particular passage we're studying. We've gotten the genre, we got the thought flow, we have the big idea, and have seen our passage in that thought flow. Now we're going to do on a micro level what we've already done on a macro level. We're going to outline the thought flow of the verse or the group of verses we're studying. This is a really fun place to be once we get there. We've sort of already entered into the world, into the mind of the writer. Now we're just letting the text speak for itself as we see the writer's thoughts unfold a word and a sentence at a time. We're not going to have time to do this and look at this in this lesson. We're actually going to be doing that in the next lesson. For now, though, I hope you're starting to see the value in examining the context of Scripture, both the historical context as well as the literary context. Now, if all of this seems like a lot of work, well, it is, but I'm going to share some resources with you that are going to help you do this kind of contextual study without having to spend hours and days outlining a book just to begin to study a particular set of verses. Not that I would discourage that kind of study, but if we're all being honest, we really don't have that kind of time in the day. So having the tools and resources are very helpful in this process. So we're going to look at that next time, and I'll share some of those with you. So as we come, though, to study together at our next local Bible study, I want you to do a little project. It shouldn't take you too long. I want you to read through the book of Philemon. It's a short letter in the New Testament written by Paul from one individual to another individual. It's one chapter. I think it's about 25 verses. I want you to read through it, and I want you to come up with, either write it down or log it away, in your mind, come up with the big idea. So when we come together, I want you to share with the class what you think the big idea is of Philemon. I look forward to having you at our next Bible study. Hope to see you there.